Hello, and welcome to the Old and in the Way podcast, where we fight ageism one bad joke at a time. My name is Mark Lomas, and today we're talking to Joel Selvin. Joel is an American music critic and author known for his weekly column in the San Francisco Chronicle from 1972 to 2009. Joel has written books covering various aspects of pop music, including a New York Times bestseller, Red, My Uncensored Life and Rock with Sammy Hagar. Joel has published articles in Rolling Stone magazine, the Los Angeles Times, Billboard, and Melody Maker. Joel's appeared in documentaries about the music scene and has occasionally taken the stage himself as a rock and roll singer. We're thrilled to have Joel on as our guest today, so let's get on with the show and join Joel while he discusses his book, Drums and Demons, The Tragic Journey of Jim Jordan. Also, today Bob Heyman shares the co-host spot. And on with the show.
I had finished the manuscript and sent it into the publisher and took a vacation. And the first morning I was in Hawaii, the phone rang, and it was Mike Post, the guy that does all those TV themes. So Mike started his music career in high school with Jim Gordon. And he's Jim's daughter's godfather and closest friend to Jim's first wife. And when I first started the book, I had approached him about cooperation, and he was very respectful, but he said he did not see any upside to this for them, that this was a trauma that they cared not to revisit. But so there he is on the phone in Hawaii telling me that Jim had just died, and the family wanted to get a release out, get ahead of the story, but they didn't know how. And he had suggested that I might know how. So I did, and we sent out a release. And at that point, the family came into the project and loaned me photographs and conducted interviews. I revised the manuscript. But actually, the whole world changed their mind about Jim in that instance. He had gone away to jail in 1983 and really pretty much had been just totally forgotten about. He was arrested for killing his mother in a very brutal, vicious fashion, and it was just he never existed. Nobody visited him in jail. Nobody came to his trial. They just turned their backs on him. It's a shocking crime. What they didn't know is the years and years and years that went before that of torture and torment that this poor guy suffered that led up to this catastrophic event. Jim was a schizophrenic, and he was so high functioning as a studio musician and all-star rock drummer that none of the psychiatrists he saw, and he saw many, 15 residential treatment programs in 4 years, could identify it. It took the crime for them to realize how severely ill he actually was. Schizophrenia, Bob, it turns out is just amazingly common. It exists in 1 in 100 in the general population. Multiple sclerosis, by comparison, is 1 in 10,000. And so all those people sleeping under freeways, they have voices in their heads too.
Wow.
And the kind of treatment they get is just horrible. The most desultory, superficial treatment. Dial them in on drugs, kick them back out on the streets. Half the schizophrenics resist any kind of treatment. It just, you can't help them. And Jim's case was probably as extreme as they get. But the book is really an account of how disastrous mental illness can be. As it starts with a biography of one of the greatest session musicians that rock ever knew. And I detail this guy's golden life as a 17-year-old graduating from high school, going out on the road with the Everly Brothers the next day, going through all those sessions with Sonny and Cher, Nancy Sinatra, the Beach Boys, all Glenn Campbell, all these big hit records, and graduating into the British rock scene with Delaney and Bonnie and Joe Cocker and George Harrison and Derek and the Dominoes. It's just an amazing artistic life. And Jim was an extraordinarily gifted drummer. He was gifted beyond all measure of other drummers. And I'm sure that his impossible ability to precisely divide and reallocate time on a drum is rooted in the same biochemical system that his disease was rooted in.
Wow.
So all this is just loaded with irony upon irony upon irony. And the book is the first full account of both Jim's career, his phenomenal career, his extraordinary ability, and his incredible illness.
Wow. Now, he turned down opportunities for parole, I guess, or he wouldn't go to his hearings?
No, he never was interested in leaving prison. He had a 16-year sentence he did 38 years on.
Oh my God.
And yeah, he kicked out. He didn't go to parole meetings. He'd stop going to his therapy appointments or not take his meds or, some kind of act of resistance. And no, he was ill the whole time. I mean, going to prison didn't cure him, right? And he lived with those voices. One of the key elements of the book was that I acquired some research that had been done in 1988 with some people that had gotten Jim to agree to work on a book. And so I had all these transcripts of interviews with Jim in prison. And he's still mad at his mother. He still thinks that, she ruined his life and that, he had to do what he did. So it's not like he went, "Oh my God, what have I done?" No, he was ill the rest of his life.
What a topic. Just a couple of little minor points about him I wanted to get to. He was a protege of the great Hal Blaine, who was
You could say that. Hal certainly kicked a lot of jobs his way, but I mean, Jim was a fully formed drummer with his own unique voice the minute Hal Blaine laid eyes on him. I mean, that's everybody just had that same Jim Gordon flash in 1964 and 65. They'd hear him play and go, "Oh my God, what's that?" Jim Keltner, the great session drummer, talks about meeting Jim at a session. He was in a folk rock group that he thought he was going to make a single with, and he showed up there, and there was a blue Ludwig kit set up, and so he realized he wasn't going to be playing. He sat down on the floor next to the drum kit, and Jim sat down to play. And Jim Keltner's life pivoted. He went out the next day and bought a blue Ludwig kit for himself. And what he told me, and this is why, I mean, he's such a soulful guy. Keltner said, "I had to learn to play like Jim in order to not play like Jim."
Wow.
And that's true of a lot of people. There's a lot of drummers who just heard Jim Gordon play and just tried to do the same thing. And of course, Jim operated on a level of intuition that was just way above what they were trying to do. They were trying to learn what he came by naturally.
Now, he claimed credit for the keyboard lick in Layla, and then there's the controversy about that. Can you, Prasad, do you think he stole it from Rita Coolidge, his ex-girlfriend, or
I think Jim and Rita wrote that part together. Rita finished it with lyrics. Bonnie Bramlett told me about hearing Jim and Rita on grand pianos back to back in Olympic Studios during a Delaney and Bonnie session where Clapton was present, sitting at that piano and playing this piece for everybody. And then Rita told me she gave Clapton a tape of it. So I'm sure that Clapton knew where the piece came from. Layla had been recorded during the regular sessions for the album. When they came back to do the post-production in Miami a few weeks later, Clapton was not happy with the piece as it was constructed. And it was his idea to put this piano piece on the end of it. Jim took the first pass. The keyboard player and Derek and the Dominoes, Bobby Whitlock, did a second pass. Producer Tom Dowd made a composite of the two versions, and they put that on the end of the track. When Atlantic Records first put out the song as a single, they left the piano part off. And the single stalled about halfway up the charts and really didn't launch at all. And like a year and a half later, they put it out a second time, this time with the piano part on the end, and that exploded the hit. Long after the band had broken up, long after the album had come and gone, it was a top 10 hit. And that's where Rita Coolidge first heard it and realized that was her song.
Wow. Okay, I wanted to get to a few other things in your bibliography that interested me that I've known you a long time, but I had no idea about. You wrote 3 books about Ed Hardy and tattooing. How did that come about?
I did Ed's autobiography. I co-wrote it with him. I'm super proud of that book. Ed's a fantastic guy, and his work as an artist is truly monumental. All those tattoos you see out on the street, that's because of Ed Hardy. He was the first guy to see tattoo work as an art form. He dropped out of SF Art Institute. Well, he didn't drop out, he graduated, but he was offered a scholarship in engraving at Yale. And he said, no, thanks. He wanted to open a tattoo shop. You can't imagine what people thought in the art world of that in 1967. You're going to what?
Yeah.
And Ed, because he knew he was going to live in San Francisco, went up to Vancouver to do his first tattoo shop because he didn't want his early work walking around San Francisco.
Awesome. Wow. And then
Jim,
you wrote a book called Face the Music, which I tried to order and it was out of print. But tell me about that. There's a fascinating premise to that.
What's the book?
Face the Music? It's not you. You're credited with it. It's photographs of musicians and about their thought process.
Face of Music. Oh yeah, that's Rick Ehrlich. Oh yeah, he's a anesthesiologist. He's a big deal in at UCLA, and he has a crazy hobby of taking photographs of musicians listening to their favorite songs.
Right.
And so there are these full face close-ups of like Quincy Jones, listening to music, or Huey Lewis listening to music. So yeah. I did the captions for that. It was fun.
Okay, seems very cool.
Bob,
And then
Bob,
yeah, go ahead, Mark.
Joel, which artists or bands have been your favorite to interview and work with, and what made those interactions special?
One of the most entertaining interviews I ever had was with a guy named Sam Samudio, who you know as Sam the Sham.
Wow.
And he had a album out on Atlantic in like 1972, and he was traveling around the country with a rather famous promo guy named Mario Medias. And they were like a comedy team. They had me on the floor of the hotel room for like an hour and a half. They were hilarious. Of course, I was 22 years old, and interviews in that day were like postgraduate seminars. I remember sitting on the floor of a hotel room in Oakland with Bobby Bland while he drank gin out of a bottle and mixed it with water from a picnic thermos that he drank out of, like that. And he just told me so much. I mean, I learned so much about life on the road, about what African-American musicians thought of white people. I mean, he was amazing.
Wow.
I remember he told me that he didn't really get into that argument about white people being able to sing the blues or not. He says he knew white people suffered pain. Who's that guy that sings Fire and Rain? Yeah, he knows what pain is. Wow.
I was wondering if there are any musicians or figures in the industry that you believe are underrated and overlooked.
Oh, a few thousand. Yeah, sure. I mean, where do you want to go? There's a drummer named Gary Chester you've never heard of, who's worked in New York and played on every Burt Bacharach record, every Lieber and Stoller record. He was just phenomenal. Nobody knows his name, but I mean, the whole underrated thing. I mean, Ry Cooder's underrated,
Absolutely.
and he's kind of famous in his own way, but he's not as famous as he is great. There's a lot of that out there. The success and fame is not a coefficient of quality.
In that vein, you wrote a whole book about Burt Burns, and I don't think a lot of people have heard of Burt Burns. Can you talk about him?
Yeah, Burt Burns was a fascination and a near obsession for me. I spent 16 years working on that book. He was a songwriter and record producer in New York in the early 60s that made these intensely soulful records and wrote these sort of Cuban-esque songs like Twist and Shout and Hang On Sloopy. Uh, he was diagnosed with a damaged heart as a teenager, told he wouldn't live to be 21. And at the end of his career, which lasted all of 7 years, he got involved in the music business kind of late in life. He was wrapped up with a bunch of gangster types. So the whole story has a big Sopranos finish. And the idea that this guy with a damaged heart could write, go on and take another little piece of my heart. And it never really left me, It was like there was something so intensely soulful about that. But the book did really well for a book about somebody nobody ever heard of. And 2 years later, Burns was installed in the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame. They made a documentary called Bang, the Burt Burns story, out of my book. And we succeeded in bringing this guy as much back to life as you can bring back someone who's been dead 50 years.
Wow. Now you wrote a book about the last days of the Grateful Dead. Dennis McNally told me that there are, on any given weekend, there are 800 Grateful Dead cover bands playing around the country. And there's Fleetwood Mac cover bands and Tom Petty cover bands. And I had a promoter tell me the only thing people want to come out and see is music they already heard of. And so he's booking nothing but cover bands, or they're now called tribute bands. I was just curious what you thought about that. Does it mean there's not much opportunity for young, musicians doing new music? Is it a good thing or a bad thing?
Well, the art movement's over, Bob, and it's followed the history of every art movement. With starting with an avant-garde school that worked its way into the mainstream, and they sorted through all the ideas until it reaches a sort of peak, and then the ideas start getting repeated with diminishing returns until you have hotel lobbies filled with abstract expressionist paintings, right? And we're at that stage now where there isn't any rock music anymore. The old guys that used to make it, nobody wants to hear new music from them. And the new young people that make rock music, they call it alternative rock. So the old stuff is just gone. It's dead. It's just not happening. And by the way, hip hop's dead too. The art movements expend themselves. So here you are, in the quarter of the way through the 21st century, and what's left of authentic rock culture is this detritus, right? This residue, this bathtub rain, and tribute bands are a part of that. Tom Petty is not available to perform anymore, so go out and see David Grisman's kid sing Tom Petty's songs. As far as opportunities for young musicians, I mean, it's just not out there anymore. People are not that interested in original music. People aren't that interested in the pop charts anymore. And by the way, the whole industry was taken over by these massive multinational corporations that started to market music like soap sometime back in the 80s, kind of ruined their product. That's a short answer. How long do you want to go on this?
No,
No, that's a great answer.
smart ass.
What you think Jerry would think of the Dead music catalog at least being bigger than ever?
Because and all the multinational corporations are buying up the catalogs now.
Yeah.
The music is done, the art movement is over, but it's still current in some strange way. I went to see Dead and Company a few times, and the audience, 3/4 of them were born after Jerry Garcia died.
Yeah. Yeah.
What does this music hold for them? I don't know. It's like you and me going to a Glenn Miller concert. It's not their culture. It's not their time. It's not their music, but they've embraced it. And the Grateful Dead turn out to be one of the musical acts of that era who stood for something. And that is why they are not like the Jay Giles band. You know, nobody's writing books about how the Jay Giles band broke up. Uh, it's amazing to me. What happened to the Dead is just so amazing. And for those of us who were in San Francisco in the 60s when you had to put up with them being on every bill, it's truly remarkable. Uh, One of the funny things that happened was that Grateful Dead tape trading became a thing in East Coast prep schools in the 80s. So all these like youth of privileged youth of the Brahmin class in the East Coast were trading Grateful Dead tapes and creating this deadhead culture. They graduated from their private schools, went to university, and took their positions on Wall Street. And they became the Grateful Dead's constituency in the late 90s. And everything upscaled. I mean, the amount of private jets that went into Fare Thee Well in Chicago is just astonishing. So it turned out they're upscale phenomenon, tightly associated with the use of LSD, so that like everybody that goes to a Grateful Dead concert knows that that's sort of the secret password. And as long as people still take LSD, people will still go to Grateful Dead type concerts, and they've been linked in a way that, like, bootleg gin was associated with Louis Armstrong jazz records in the
Is
20s.
LSD still that prevalent? Wow. I thought it had its
LSD
time.
never went away, Mark.
Oh, Jesus.
Well,
And are you experienced, Joel?
Have I ever been experienced?
Yes.
You know, I dosed myself plenty back when Owsley was making it and all that. And then when I was doing the Altamont book in 2016, I kind of got nostalgic about the whole thing, and it was a little difficult to find any samples of this stuff because my crowd had all aged out of LSD use. But I did take a few more experiences just a few years ago, just sort of refresh my recollection. And it was amusing.
I was friends with Alton Kelly, and I got a taste of the Owsley, and it was so good. I was under the impression that I will never have this experience as qualitative as this. And it was the last time I ventured into that area because I was never going to be able to find anything equivalent or better.
It's true. And my experience in the 21st century would substantiate that. It was kind of a weak cup of tea compared to what we were wandering around with in the 60s.
Yeah, I've had some moments where I was wondering what was going on, but the Owsley thing was pretty amazing.
Was
I have to
indeed.
add that my sailboat partner years and years ago was a guy named Tim Sand, who was the acid chemist for Tim Leary at Millbrook, and who was the creator of Orange Sunshine. But the whole LSD Grateful Dead thing that survives seems to be a brilliant exercise in branding.
So, are there any other musical journalists right now that you follow, pay attention to, or think are interesting?
Well, I keep up on the field, and there's tons of great work being done out there. Uh, you know, it's such a sort of subset of nonfiction, the music writing, and the people that are devoted to it tend to be focused on that, although who has a book out of his music writing this last year is David Remnick, the editor of the New Yorker.
Oh,
And
wow.
he's a hell of a good music critic.
Huh.
Of course, he's a guy who can, be writing an article about Aretha Franklin and think, let's see what Obama has to say about him and get Obama on the phone. And then Obama says something like, when Aretha sings, you hear the entire history of America. I'm like, what's that?
Wow.
You wrote a book called Hollywood Eden, which was about movies and rock and music, movies and rock and roll. Can you talk about that one a little bit?
It's about how rock and roll started in Los Angeles, and it focuses on the 1958 graduating class of University High School in Santa Monica, where Jan and Dean went to high school with Gidget. Nancy Sinatra was in the class, Bruce Johnston of the Beach Boys, a record producer named Kim Fowley. It just goes on and on. This tight little group of people out of that one high school class became the seed for what would, in 8 short years, bring us Good Vibrations by the Beach Boys, probably the greatest pop music record ever. So that's what Hollywood Eden is. It follows this group of people who were teenagers smitten with rock and roll in the first rock and roll high school class. I mean, Rock Around the Clock was when they were in 10th grade. And they were the ones that started it all in Los Angeles. They became Jan and Dean, the Beach Boys, the Mamas and Papas, Sonny and Cher. All of that came out of this one sort of small place.
Wow. I just read that Brian Wilson not only just lost his wife, but diagnosed with dementia. It just seems.
Well, that's not new. Brian, like Jim, has been schizophrenic for a long, long time. And his return to performance is a tribute to the miraculous power of personality drugs. He really, if he hadn't been rich and cared for so well, he would have spent his life in a mental institution.
Joel, did you see the documentary on Brian Wilson's Smile, Return to the Smile album that they put in storage because all these fires had broken out? And then, not using the Beach Boys, he brought in all these new young musicians, and they premiered their show at the London something or other.
Royal Albert Hall, about 2008 or something like that.
But
Yeah, imagine going back 50
the,
years and finishing a record you started and you could never finish. He brought in Van Dyke Parks, who was a lyricist on the original Smile album, to help him. And that band of young musicians you're talking about is a Los Angeles group called Wondermints. And the musical director was a fellow named Jeffrey Foskett. Jeffrey just died. He had spent 17 years on the back of the Beach Boys stage, playing guitar and singing Brian Wilson's high vocal parts.
Wow.
And Brian hired him to be his musical director. And the Wondermints were this fabulous LA pop rock band.
I was listening to them yesterday.
They were so thrilled to be making Brian Wilson music. And it was just a phenomenal collaboration. At one point, Al Jardine from the Beach Boys joined in and was touring with this group. And I had dinner with Al before the show one night in Oakland. And I said, Al, these guys play Brian's music better than the Beach Boys do. And he went, yeah, they do.
But Joel, in that documentary, for me, the tearjerker was when he was brought together with Paul McCartney. And Paul McCartney talked about how they idolized the Beach Boys. And when Pet Sound came out, they were in a competition, and Pet Sounds kind of created Sgt. Pepper.
One of the very final scenes in Hollywood Eden is Bruce Johnston in London with test pressings of Pet Sounds, coming back to his hotel room to find Paul McCartney and John Lennon waiting for him, wanting to hear the record.
Wow.
They listened to the record in the hotel room. twice, and then they go back to McCartney's place and they write Here, There, and Everywhere for the Revolver album.
Well, thank you for blowing my mind today, Joel. That's wonderful. That's
It's a good scene.
Yeah.
wow.
No kidding.
Wow. Thank you. Bob, should we wrap this up before we get bounced off? We're on the cheap account. We only get 40 minutes.
Ricky Nelson, California Rockabilly,
Yeah.
and you know, James Burton on guitar, and yeah, no, those records are very good. And Rick was, you know, like many people, was underrated at the time. And especially now, he's almost totally forgotten. But in 1958, when Elvis went into the army, Rick was at the top of the pile. And the Altamont book is kind of the definitive account of that concert, and it's being bruited as a streaming series. The people who acquired the rights have just signed Chris Columbus to direct. So who knows? I certainly I wish them luck.
Yeah.
And what was the third one you mentioned? Was
Sly, I
Rick
was
Nelson?
talking about mental illness. So was he one of those, you think? Sly Stone?
No, you know, those guys are affected by other syndromes. What my friend Brian Rohan used to call the situationally acquired narcissism syndrome, the diva disease.
Yeah. I miss Brian Rohan.
Oh man, you know, he called every morning sometime between 6 and 8 to see if there was anybody in the obits he wanted to know about.
Great character. I don't know if you knew who he was, Mark, but he was a music lawyer.
He's an attorney. I have family that has used him.
Well,
I know
He
more than
punched-
I know more than I should.
He punched David Geffen
yes.
at the Polo Lounge during Clive Davis's first Grammy party. And Geffen was sitting between Paul Simon and Clive Davis, and he leaned over a table and just clocked him and didn't leave the party. So sometime later, Paul Simon comes up to Brian and looks at him scornfully and says, "I don't approve of violence." And Brian looked at him and said, "At your size, I wouldn't either."
All right, Bob.
Okay, let's wind it up. But I law clerked in that office, and Brian was a great character. Joel, thank you. This was fabulous.
Let's go lunch again sometime, Bob. It's been ages, 20 years probably.
I would love that. Let's for sure do that. Thank you.
Thank
Nice
you guys.
meeting you. Take care.
Likewise, Mark.